Chapter 105. Does the whale's magnitude diminish? Will he perish? Inasmuch then as this Leviathan comes floundering down upon us from the headwaters of the eternities, and may be fitly inquired whether, in the long course of his generations, he has not degenerated from the original bulk of his sires. But upon investigation we find that not only are the whales of the present day superior in magnitude to those whose fossil remains were found in the tertiary system, embracing a distinct geological period prior to man, but of those whales found in that tertiary system, those belonging to its latter formations exceed in size those of its earlier ones. Of all of the pre-Adamite whales yet exhumed, by far the largest is the Alabama one mentioned in the last chapter, and that was less than 70 feet in length in the skeleton. Whereas we have already seen that tape measure gives us 72 feet for the skeleton of a large-sized modern whale, and I have heard on whalesmen's authorities that sperm whales have been captured near 100 feet long at the time of capture. But may it not be that while the whales of the present hour are in advance in magnitude upon those of all previous geological periods, may it not be that since Adam's time they have degenerated? Assuredly, we must conclude so if we are to credit the accounts of such gentlemen as Pliny and the ancient naturalists generally. For Pliny tells us of whales that embraced acres of living bulk, and Aldrovandus of others which measured 800 feet in length, rope walks and Thames tunnels of whales, and, even in the days of Banks and Solander, Cook's naturalists, we find a Danish member of the Academy of Sciences setting down to certain Icelandic whales, Radinsfiskar, or wrinkled bellies, at 120 yards, that is, 360 feet. And Lacépède, the French naturalist, in his elaborate history of whales, in the very beginning of his work, page 3, sets down the right whale at 100 meters, 328 feet, and this work was published so late as A.D. 1825. But will any whaleman believe these stories? No. The whale of today is as big as his ancestors in Pliny's time, and if I go to where Pliny is, I, a whaleman, more than he was, will make bold to tell him so, because I cannot understand how it is that, while the Egyptian mummies that were buried thousands of years before Pliny was born do not measure so much in their coffins as a modern Kentuckian in his socks, and while the cattle and other animals sculptured on the oldest Egyptian and Nineveh tablets, by the relative proportions in which they are drawn, just as plainly prove that the high-bred, stale-fed, prize cattle of Smithfield not only equal, but far exceed in magnitude the fattest of Pharaoh's kine. In the face of all this, I will not admit that of all animals the whale alone should have degenerated. But still another inquiry remains, one often agitated by more recondite Nantucketers, whether owing to the almost omniscient lookouts at the mastheads of whale ships now penetrating even through the Bering Straits, and into the remotest secret drawers and lockers of the world, and the 1,000 harpoons and lances darted along all continental coasts. The moot point is whether Leviathan can long endure so wide a chase and so remorseless a havoc, whether he must not at last be exterminated from the waters, and the last whale, like the last man, smoke his last pipe, and then himself evaporate in the final puff. Compared the humped herds of whales with the humped herds of buffalo, which not 40 years ago overspread by tens of thousands the prairies of Illinois and Missouri, and shook their iron manes and scowled with their thunder-clotted brows upon the sites of populous river capitals, where now the polite broker sells you land at $1 an inch, in such comparison an irresistible argument would seem furnished, to show that the hunted whale cannot now escape speedy extinction. But you must look at this matter in every light. Though so short a period ago, not a good lifetime, the census of the buffalo in Illinois exceeded the census of men now in London. And though at present not one horn or hoof of them remains in all that region, and though the cause of this wondrous extermination was the spear of man, yet far different nature of the whale hunt peremptorily forbids so inglorious an end to the Leviathan. 40 men in one ship hunting the sperm whales for 48 months think they have done extremely well, and thank God if at last they carry home the oil of 40 fish. Whereas in the old days of the Canadian and Indian hunters and trappers of the West, when the far West, in whose sunset the sun still rise, was a wilderness and a virgin, the same number of moccasined men for the same number of months, mounted on horse instead of sailing on ships, would have slain not 40 but 40,000 and more buffalo. A fact that, if need were, could be statistically stated. Nor, considered aright, does it seem any argument in favor of the gradual extinction of the sperm whale. For example, that in former years, the latter part of the last century, say, these leviathans in small pods were encountered much oftener than at present, and in consequences the voyages were not so prolonged, and were also much more remunerative. Because, as has been elsewhere noticed, those whales, influenced by some views to safety, now swim the seas in immense caravans, so large that to a large degree the scattered solitaires, yolks, and pods, and schools of other days are now aggregated into vast, but widely separated, unfrequent armies. That is all. And equally fallacious seems the conceit that because the so-called whalebone whales no longer haunt many grounds in former years abounding with them, hence that species also is declining. For they are only being driven from promontory to cape, and if one coast is no longer enlivened with their jets, then be sure some other remoter strand has been very recently startled by the unfamiliar spectacle. Furthermore, concerning these last mentioned leviathans, they have two firm fortresses, which, in all human probability, will forever remain impregnable. And upon the invasion of their valleys, the frosty Swiss have retreated to their mountains. So hunted from the savannas and glades of the middle seas, the whalebone whales can at last resort to their polar citadels, and diving under the ultimate glassy barriers and walls there, come up among icy fields and floes, and in a charmed circle of everlasting December, bid defiance to all pursuit from man. But as perhaps 50 of these whalebone whales are harpooned for one cachalot, philosophers of the forecastle have concluded that this positive havoc has already seriously diminished their battalions. But though for some time past a number of these whales, not less than 13,000, have been annually slain on the northwest coast by the Americans alone, yet there are considerations which render even this circumstance of little or no account as an opposing argument in the matter. Natural as it is it to be somewhat incredulous concerning the populousness of the more enormous creatures of the globe. Yet what shall we say to Harto, the historian of Goa, when he tells us that at one hunting of the king of Siam took 4,000 elephants, that in those regions elephants are numerous as droves of cattle in the temperate climes, and there seems no reason to doubt that if these elephants, which have now been hunted for thousands of years by Semiramis, by Porus, by Hannibal, and by all the successive monarchs of the East, if they still survive there in great numbers, much more may the great whale outlast all hunting, since he has a pasture to expatiate in, and precisely twice as large as all of Asia, both Americas, Europe and Africa, New Holland, and all the isles of the sea combined. Moreover, we are to consider that from the presumed great longevity of the whales, their probability of attaining the age of a century or more, and therefore at any one period of time, several distinct generations, adult generations, must be contemporary. And what that is we may soon gain some idea of by imagining all the graveyards, cemeteries, and family vaults of creation, yielding up the live bodies of all men, women, and children who were alive 75 years ago, and adding this countless host to the present human population of the globe. Wherefore, for all these things, we account the whale immortal in his species, however perishable his individuality. He swam the seas before the continents broke water. He once swam over the sides of the Tuileries in Windsor Castle and the Kremlin. In Noah's flood he despised Noah's Ark. And if ever the world is to again be flooded like the Netherlands, to kill off its rats, then the eternal whale will survive, and, rearing upon the topmost crest of the equatorial flood, spout his front head defiance to the skies. This is the end of chapter 105. And here he hints at the extinction of whales. Now, whales have come close to going extinct. There was a treaty which banned the killing of them in the 70s, which pretty much saved them. It was long thought that whales would go extinct. They actually made a Star Trek movie about that, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, where after the events of Star Trek 2 and 3, Kirk is heading back to Earth on a Klingon ship, and the Earth is in the process of being destroyed by aliens who are looking for humpback whales. So there's a weird thing in time travel, and Kirk goes back to the 80s when the movie was made, and, goes back to get whales. The thing is that whales have started to make a comeback, because they stopped being hunted. And as he hints, you have several generations of whales all giving birth at the same, all, making new baby whales. Whales, one calf every 2 to 4 years, for the larger ones, the blues, the sperms, the right whales. Some have recovered better than others. The humpbacks are doing wonderfully. The sperm whales, not quite so much, but they're still starting to recover. The blue whales are recovering slowly. They're larger and breed slower, so there's fewer of them. But the numbers are constantly increasing, which is a good sign. Their numbers have got down very small, so we'll see if there's any genetic issues with, when there's a concentration, you can have founder effects, but if the population grows up enough, then you can kind of get around those. But we'll see what happens. But as he said, whales can be a century. That's a little bit high. It's probably more like 60 or 80 years. And they start having baby whales at around 15. So that's 65 years of every whale every 4 years. So that's, you can get a few whale generations in there, 15, 16 whale generations. So you can have 16 whales out of every pair. So you end up multiplying the number by 8. But that takes half a century. So the whale numbers will eventually recover. They will eventually recover. So I hope someday, to see more whales. Whales are awesome, spectacular, majestic creatures. He talks about the buffalo going extinct, or almost extinct, being pushed out of Chicago, or pushed out of Illinois. Now, I mentioned when talking about Around the World in 80 Days, how buffalo were almost wiped out and were actually reintroduced and making a comeback. So it is possible for these animals to make a comeback. There are some animals that may not ever make a comeback, like the rhinoceros. The dodo, yeah. Lolly called down the dodo. The dodo is extinct. It died from being very tasty and very slow. So it was this slow bird that reproduced slowly. So, whales reproduce slowly, but they can get away with that because they live a long time. But the dodo laid one egg. It's a bird the size of a chicken that laid an egg almost as big as an ostrich. So what you had was or maybe I guess it was turkey-sized, but it was not a really big bird. But it laid a relatively large egg, and the egg took a long time to develop. And so when people brought rats accidentally and pigs intentionally to the islands where the dodo lived, these things just feasted on their eggs, feasted on the dodos, and the dodos went away. But there are some animals that have gone extinct for various reasons. There are some that are right on the cusp, and for instance, the rhinoceros. You can see rhinoceroses in zoos right now. There are maybe a few thousand left in the wild. Those might be done for. I was lucky enough to see a wild one in Kruger Park in South Africa, and so I was lucky enough to see one. I mean, they were rare being sighted there. There was a dozen of them in the park, and it's the size of Delaware. So imagine trying to find one particular car or one of a dozen cars wandering around something that's okay, maybe it's smaller than Delaware, but it's a good sized park. So imagine trying to find one of 12 of these things over, let's see, 300 square miles. So it's a huge area. And, finding 12 of these things, and we actually managed to see one which was just wonderful because they are rare and you don't see them. And they're shy, they're afraid of people. So rhinos have almost been wiped out. We'll see if they recover. I don't have much hope for that. I don't have much hope for rhinos recovering. Elephants seem to be doing a little bit better, but those are kind of in trouble. There are some things that you would think just wouldn't be wiped out. There was a bird called the passenger pigeon, which was kind of like a modern pigeon, the pigeons that you see in the cities. And these things just swarmed. And because they swarmed and because they were so social, it made it really easy to catch and kill thousands of them at a time. And so what happened was they were hunted. And they were hunted by various different means that just took advantage of their clustering together. So they would go and they would just kill millions of these things and then ship the meat off to the city and sell them for, it was like 5 for a penny or something silly like that. It's just really cheap meat. And the passenger pigeon was hunted to extinction. And Audubon said that when flocks of these flew over, it darkened the sky for 5 days. So imagine birds flying overhead and you cannot see the sky for 5 whole days. There were just these swarms and swarms and swarms of them. Other things have been driven extinct, and it's kind of a good thing. There is a parasite that causes a really nasty disease in animals, cows and cattle, and that's been, Rinderpest has been extincted. Smallpox has been extincted, and that's a virus and is a horrible condition. It kills lots and lots of people. I talked about that in the vaccine video, that, smallpox is one of those things that we wiped out and it was good. There used to be locusts out in California, and the locusts would come out and eat the crops, and there's stories of the Mormons going to see that. And when we went to Salt Lake City, drove through Salt Lake City, they have a statue to the pigeon or to the seagulls that saved the first Mormon settlers from the locust plague. The thing is that the locust plague is extinct. There are no more locusts in California. They haven't been seen in 75 years, and everyone's like, okay, that thing's gone, and kind of good riddance. So some things people get rid of, and it's a good thing. The crop-eating locusts and smallpox, rinderpest. Getting rid of those is good. Getting rid of whales is bad. They just read a news article recently that talked about how the whales are responsible for a lot of krill. So you have these whales, the humpback whales and such, the other baleen whales that eat the krill. And they're actually responsible for there being more krill than there would be if they weren't eating it, because they looked at areas where the whales were making a comeback, and there was actually more krill there. And they figured out what it was that when the whale eat the krill, the whales return, we'll go with return iron to the environment, because they eat the krill have the iron, and then they poop it out. And that fertilizes the water, and so the algae grow. So the algae grow more than they would if the whales weren't around. And because the algae grow more than the whales, if the whales weren't around, then there's more algae for the krill, so the krill don't end up starving. So you have this cycle where the whales return the iron into the system, while with the krill, I guess the krill eat it, die, and sink to the bottom. But the whales recycle the iron, and because the iron gets recycled, it allows for more krill to live. So it's this really cool thing that whales are very beneficial to the environment. I've often wondered how much they contribute to deep ocean storing, because you have the sperm whales diving down 800 to 1,000 feet. They go down 1,000 feet. On their way back up, they're bringing up water from the depths. And the water from the depths doesn't have as much oxygen, but it also has a lot more dissolved minerals. So there's a phenomenon that happens in South America. Happens along the west coast of South America in the winter, specifically around Christmas, called the El Nino. And what happens with the El Nino is cold water from the bottom of the ocean starts rising up because the warm water is pushed off. So the warm water is pushed off the coast, cold water upwells, and when the cold water upwells, you have all of these minerals that come up from the bottom of the ocean. So all of this comes up, and all of a sudden there's this boom in plankton. There's this boom in algae. There's this boom in fish that eat all of this stuff. So it's this sort of wonderful thing where, you have all sorts of new life being generated because you have the water being stirred up. And I've often wondered how much the whales diving down deep and coming up stir up the water. I mean, it's not like wind blowing off of the coast and completely changing the climate. But at the same time, I wonder about these things, and maybe in 20 years, when you're a marine biologist, you can write a paper on this and reference the video in the footnotes and says, hey, my pop thought of this. Anyway, that's that.